Hello, this is Janae Segura Brown in Independence, Missouri, and this is a research project proposal in Ed 631 for Park University. My research is entitled Museum 2.0. It's a participation action research proposal for the National Frontier Trails Museum. This research proposal comes out of the fields of museum studies and adult learning and uses the medium of participation. When we think about what roles museums play in our culture, we agree museums play a critical role in cultural conservation. So museum researchers are always looking for ways to stay relevant with their audiences while maintaining their mission to preserve the past. I'm interested in adult learning in non-school contexts like the museum. Actually, adult learning is of research interest to both adult education and museum studies, but surprisingly, little collaborative research between the two fields exists. And visitors to cultural institutions like museums want to consume and share and remix the content. This research project captures participation and measures it quantitatively and qualitatively. The National Frontier Trails Museum, located in Independence, Missouri. The research question is, what kind of participatory exhibits and activities help adult visitors connect their understanding of museum content to their own life experience? So, the research context. The National Frontier Trails Museum was established in 1989, and it has about 18,000 visitors a year from around the United States and the world. It is the national headquarters of the Oregon-California Trails Association, and it's got the largest public research library in the nation focused on overland trails and the settlement of the American West. In this context, a 3-year research project examines how participation opportunities will impact adult learning and help meet the museum's mission. The National Frontier Trail Museum's mission is to bring people together to share ideas about how the American westward expansion shaped our world. The research justification. This research is important to museum studies because how cultural institutions influence adult learning can provide museums with a useful framework for understanding their own influence on visitors. The research is also important to adult education because there is relatively little research on how adults learn in non-school contexts. But really, this research is even more important as a point of connection, of alliance, really, between these two fields. Adult education brings a fundamental understanding of how adult learning relates to culture, power, and creative agency to museum studies. But speaking more practically, this research is important to real problems at the National Frontier Trails Museum. This visitor quote, this is left this comment on a travel website, and she remarks about the poor conditions of the museum. But interestingly, she still learned something during her visit. And there are dozens of such unsolicited comments about the National Frontier Trails on travel websites. My proposed research taps into this potential for visitor participation. This museum really is the pride and joy of many stakeholders in Independence, but there is some resistance to change from them, maybe out of a fear of change, or maybe because there's a perception that there's a lack of funds to really make a difference, or there's just too many chiefs and not enough Indians, if you'll pardon the reference. My proposed research model gathers all of these voices and facilitates their knowledge and experience to come up with workable solutions. Finally, there's new governance at the city level, and this new governance is open to making changes in facility design and internet access and exhibit design at the museum. So my proposed research model is a good fit for the changes being proposed right now because my model provides a mechanism for institutional understanding of the purpose and the possibilities of participation-based services and programming. In fact, a survey of museum grant research reveals that museums are using grant monies to develop participatory programming over other needs like professional development and tech activities, exhibit activities, and collection activities. want to take a moment and just define participation specifically. Here in this study, participation is a voluntary activity that contributes to museum content, creates new museum content, or collaborates with museum staff, community members, or other visitors around museum content. So what does the literature say about these three areas? In adult learning, a key researcher, Robin Grenier, she did some research on adult learning in museums, and she suggests that it's learning that drives participation. But on the other hand, Sotyra Greck's museum study on adult participation found that when an activity was marketed as educational, some adults were discouraged from participating. In the museum studies literature, there's a Falk and Deerking are museum researchers that developed a very influential model that explains how museum impacts visitor learning. There are dozens of studies that use this model in the design of their exhibit and try to glean what kind of learning is happening based off the design changes they make in their exhibits. Now, in the third strand of my research is all about participation. With the advent of the internet, participation is a lot easier to measure. There are two key characteristics about participation that I want to relate to my project here, and one of them is this concept of participation inequality. The 1% rule, as it's referred to in an online participation context, 89% of people will spectate, 9% of them will interact, and 1% only will contribute content. And that is a little bit discouraging considering how much effort people put into their online platforms. But there's more research out there by Lee and Burnoff that suggests that participation inequality can be mitigated and even overcome. And I developed this graphic representation of their research, which found that that people fall along a continuum of participation depending on content and context. So this really suggests that if you've got depending on what your platform is and how you develop your participatory opportunities, people will spectate, or they might join in, they might rate or review or comment on something, they might compile it or organize it or share it. There's lots of ways that people can participate. So what are the gaps in the literature? Okay, there are two gaps that are important to this study, and one of them is that there's a gap in the research on adult learning in non-school contexts like museums. That gap really comes out of the fact that it's difficult to measure learning in non-school contexts. But participation research has made this easier to do. Now, the other gap is that there's the discourse between adult education and museum studies. There isn't really one. There hasn't been a lot of collaborative work between these two fields, even though they both study adult learning. So my research attempts to address these gaps. So the research aim and objective. The actual research proposal will investigate what kinds of participatory opportunities will produce the desired visitor response at the National Frontier Trails Museum. The objectives are to improve visitor experience, measure adult learning, and improve exhibit design. The research design makes three assumptions. The first one, each stakeholder and visitor holds unique knowledge related to the National Frontier Trails Museum that is unarticulated yet closely tied to their understanding of the museum's role in society. The second assumption is that participation with museum content in relation to visitor experience is not understood by stakeholders. The third assumption is that participation with museum content is desired by visitors. Now, the research paradigm that I'm choosing for this project is participation action research. There are three important tenets in the conceptual framework of this paradigm. The first one is communication arenas. Everyone in this circle has a stake in developing what participation can look like at the National Frontier Trails Museum. The purpose of the communication arena is to collect everyone's experience, practice, and expertise to build a shared knowledge and a shared feedback mechanism and a shared evaluation instrument. Another tenet of participation action research is the consensual iterative cycles. This is a big part of the paradigm. It's periodic planning and periodic acting and periodic evaluation between the researcher and the stakeholders. It's essential to developing workable and sustainable solutions. The third tenet is capacity building for self-organization. This final piece is so important because the research is intended to both contribute to theory but also be practical to the problems at the museum. So the researchers as the main change agent and data collection instrument is always working toward establishing an integrated network of museum stakeholders who can incorporate and sustain the research findings into museum practice. So with that conceptual framework, this is my research model. You can see it is a three-phase model. Phase 1 being an experimental phase where participation elements are experimented with. In this phase, we'll develop a feedback process, and we will develop quality and quality standards of participation. We collect data in this phase. We collect qualitative and quantitative data, and we use that data to measure the output here in phase 2. We measure quantitatively the number of participants that are engaged, among other things, and we measure the quality of visitor-contributed content, and this leads to new skills in participation and quality standards developed, and the institutionalization of efforts. And this is a way that participation will grow at the museum, and the capacity to sustain participation will grow. And then in phase 3, we'll be able to see changes in visitor engagement, and this is going to come from all of the data that's collected over periodically throughout all 3 of the phases, and we'll be able to mark exactly where the changes that were made, the inputs that we put, had impact on visitor engagement at the end. So as I mentioned, the data collection is ongoing throughout the model. When we talk about quantitative data, we want to count the number and the type of individuals that participate, the number and type of the stakeholders that are engaged in this process, the number of staff and the volunteer hours that are spent in developing participation platforms, the number of events that are held, and the amount of new information that's produced each time. Qualitatively, we want to look at the levels of understanding about participatory design from stakeholders. We want to look at the levels of understanding about the cultural significance of the museum from the visitors themselves. We want to measure the levels of participation among visitors, thinking back to that participation continuum. We also want to measure the levels of capacity among the stakeholders, and of course the quality of visitor-generated content is going to be of great importance to the quality of adult learning and what kind of adult learning is going on. So as you can see, this is a very doable, it's a very practical, and it's also a significant participation action research project for the museum and for adult education and museum studies. It's really a fantastic way to gauge a museum's impact on adult learning. It will add to the discourse between the 2 fields of museum studies and adult education. It will also facilitate the changes that are already upon the museum and help cultivate a culture of participation that adult visitors really expect now from their cultural institutions. Thank you very much for watching my research proposal for the National Frontier Trails Museum. I'd love to have your comments and your feedback on this proposal. Just leave them in the comment section below this video. Thanks again for watching.